The competition was organised by the Architecture Foundation, as I said, with funding from the Housing Corporation. And one of the first tasks that the Architecture Foundation faced was to find a client, somebody who would build the foyer. So they had a small competition for bids from other housing associations. Shape Housing Association from Birmingham won the contract to become the client. The reason that they got that contract was primarily because they had a site, which is an existing parking lot in Birmingham, which is where they're based, next to Snow Hill Station. A site which is next to a hostel for homeless men. Shape, as an organisation, have a continuing involvement in house building in Birmingham and in the provision of various types of housing, kind of non-standard housing types. And they had bid in the previous year for another foyer project. As some of the speakers tonight may point out, bidding for foyers has become a kind of lucrative pastime for housing associations. It's one of the few areas of housing provision which can still get funding. One of the first tasks that Shape had was to write a brief. And this they did with advice from the Architecture Foundation, who were interested in promoting the work of young architects, and Davis, Langton and Everest, quantity surveyors, and a number of other technical advisors. That brief defined the foyer as it was to be designed in the competition as a collection of rooms, a little bit like a hotel, with a lecture theatre and teaching facilities, restaurants, canteen, cafe, and an explicitly stated relationship between the public parts of that building that were characterised as public, i.e. the lecture theatre, entrance lobbies, cafes and restaurants, as being the key mediating device between the foyer and the city and between the occupants and society in a larger sense. So it's a kind of hotel, it's a kind of hostel. Rents are kept fairly low, but actually, I think, compared to student housing rents in Birmingham, actually kind of on pretty much the same level. I can't remember exactly how much it is, but when I was writing the piece for the files, it seemed to me that it was very much on a par with normal kind of bed-sit rent. So it's a funny place, this foyer. Birmingham itself is going through a number of very interesting changes in its character. As I tried to map out in the piece I wrote here, its form is changing, and the attitude to the city itself is being transformed. Let's see. One of the most crucial characteristics, I suppose, of the foyer is quite how it presents itself as an institution. It's undeniably an institution. There's video surveillance was a part of the brief, 24-hour security, and a high degree of care, in inverted commas. Most of the projects grappled with that negotiation between institutional form and a kind of non-institutional character. The schemes, the three that you'll be seeing this evening, all take different views on that kind of negotiation. They also take different views about the programme. I think Robert Mull's presentation particularly will show a fairly critical, a particular kind of critical assault on the programme, which is based in the kind of practice that they've developed in their diploma unit. So on on that note, I think what I'll do is hand over to Robert, who will speak first for about 15 minutes, then later Agina, and then Peter St John and Adam Caruso. And then what I'd like to do, like last week, is conclude with about half an hour, 45 minutes of open discussion. Thank you.
David asked me to really, before actually explaining the project, just to say something about the context. I'll go. To say something about really how we approached the project, why we even entered the project. For the last 3.5 years, Katrina and I have been working almost exclusively on housing association projects and local authority projects. And we have encountered the most harrowing squeeze on funding, central government funding, in housing associations' case through the institution of HAG, Housing Association Grant. Now this has had a particular effect. It set up the most incredibly competitive bidding environment between housing associations. That has had in itself several effects. Housing associations are finding themselves adopting standards, both in terms of methods of procurement, but standards of design which are not necessarily within the best interests of their clients, their tenants. This pressure to achieve value for money has actually meant that the traditional role of the architect and quantities of air and builder and so on is being squeezed out in favour of design and build, and more insidiously, for the time being, the buying up of redundant speculative housing stock. Against this environment, the very, very sort of gradual narrowing of the possibility for housing associations and architects to do anything in social housing at all, the Architecture Foundation's, albeit temporarily, achievement in sort of fending off some of these forces in the Foyer competition was absolutely extraordinary. I think we'll talk afterwards about how successful they've been in doing that in reality. But we were not really mindful of the competition as such. What we were hoping to do was to somehow, if you like, feather our own nest somewhere down the line, so that when faced with the real situation of seeking funding for a foyer somewhere in the future, somewhere north of the M25, that in fact some of the battles would already have been won in this foyer competition, that we would stand a chance of doing something more humble than anything you'd see in this room, but something worthwhile. Our first move then was really, we have a social agenda in our foyer, but the first move really was to get some of the building blocks right, and I think I'd just like to explain something of the economy of our foyer before showing you the project. It is a cheap building, a relatively cheap building. It's low on capital expenditure, intentionally so, but the payoff for that is that it is high on maintenance, intentionally high on maintenance. We saw this ongoing maintenance of the building as being, if you like, a sort of drip-feeding grant to the foyer residents over a long period of time. This being defensible in this foyer program because the foyer itself, part of its training program were building skills. Our building attempted to use extremely, almost bland building processes which did not require the architect to be in charge of them throughout the entire process of the construction. It would not in any way be compromised by being procured by design and build. And thirdly, we tried to maximize wherever possible the foyer's ability to generate additional income and, in a sense, commercial opportunities for its residents, whilst ensuring that this additional income did not go to the housing association but went to the residents themselves. That's the first slide. So we saw these basic building blocks of of the economics of the building as being essential before we even considered any form of social program for the building itself. Our primary aim in the building was to think of it as something analogous to a laboratory. We have no answers for the Foyer program. We were simply hoping to pose certain questions in the building itself. And to do that, we thought of it as something akin to a laboratory for the formation, the testing, the tentative exploration of patterns of adult life which were not dependent upon conventional ideas of work and home. Practically, in order to communicate these ideas, we characterized the foyer in two parts. The landscape, which were the public areas of the foyer, and the lodges, which were the 120 rooms of the foyer divided into building compartments of 40 rooms. You do one more, please. The landscape occupied the canal and railway levels. I mean, we've said nothing about the site so far. The site is a sort of chasm between a railway line and the canal, and a desperate hostel for drunkards. The landscape occupies the the level of the canal and the level of the street, whereas the lodges rise out of that landscape in the form of three waves, which protrude above the railway line, addressing the railway line and the extraordinary overall landscape of Birmingham. This is a section the other way, a diagram the other way, street level, landscape below, rising out of that landscape, the three haircuts of the foyer. On the left is the landscape in use. David described it as a space of continuous derive. We see it as a space where the residents are required to take control, not in an aggressive way, but where they have the choice of manipulating the program as well as the fabric of the architecture over time, so that the foyer actually becomes a representation of their concerns, their growing aspirations and skills. On the right is a diagram drawing of the lodges. The lodges, in stark contrast to the foyer, to the landscape being free and manipulable, the lodges are almost fixed versions of a fairly orthodox domestic hierarchy of entry, bedrooms, living spaces, through to attic playrooms. I'll show you some overall drawings before showing principal cross sections. I'd like to explain the landscape in slightly more detail. The landscape has two primary and two secondary spaces. At ground, at Water Street level and canal level, which are the two lower levels of the building, it has what we call primary space number 1, primary space number 2. These provided all the daily activities of the foyer, such as educational needs, fast and slow dining rooms, and so on. But by some form of manipulation, they were also capable of being packed away, and that space being used as a venue at weekends and on special occasions, as well as a sports hall. We estimated that space would raise something like £3,000 per weekend for the foyer. Flanking, you see on the left, street level, the primary space in the centre, primary space on the right. On the top, the service wall, and on the bottom, space, secondary space again, which we call the wall of work. It's impossible to really explain the way in which the space is manipulated, but you get a feeling for the movable nature of some of the elements. As I say, running along the side of the of the primary space was the wall of work. The wall of work is 310 square metres of raw shell space, which could be fitted out, well, it could be used from a range of being fitted out in the form of conventional shop space, right through to being pressed into service in times of undoubted future crisis in Birmingham for homeless accommodation. That homeless accommodation being served by the pod kitchens and so on within the primary spaces. Separating off from that wall of work, underneath this extraordinary archway that runs off from the site, we proposed a market space which linked through to one of the market spaces within Birmingham. Again, we calculated that this space would raise a further £1,200 for the foyer each weekend. That's details of the earlier drawing, showing the two primary spaces, showing the wall of work at the bottom, and what you will see soon, the entry to the lodges, bisecting the upper floor of the landscape, giving access to the lodges above. The lodges we saw as groupings of 40 rooms. We characterised them as tribes, a way of actually recreating within the foyer some of the forces of competition, grouping, tribalism, fads, if you like, which actually motivated youth culture outside the walls of the foyer. 3 competing lodges, each separated from each other except in means of escape, access to the lodges being prescribed through the landscape. As you passed up through the building, you entered from the entry to the foyers in 3 places, to the lodges in 3 points in the landscape. You started an archetypical process of entering the house. You crossed voids within the landscape, across garden paths, past the garden gate, through the front door, past the lodge master's office, up into the lodge space, eventually culminating in the attic space at the very top of the lodges within that barrel. Reinforcing that vertical hierarchy were a series of visual icons which were programmable or interferable with by each of the lodge teams. From very simple devices such as the easily reprogrammable LED displays and blackboards and so on. It went right up through. On the left you see some of those elements. To the advertising hoardings which characterised each side of each lodge. This advertising hoarding acting as some form of sponsorship, the income of which was directly related to the lodge itself. Again, we calculated that would bring in an income. It's in a prime location overlooking the railway line of some £57,500 a year for the foyer, divided between the 3 lodges. Again, you just see some of those elements we spoke of, crossing the landscape, movement up through into the lodge itself, eventually going up through to the very top and to the roundels, the advertising roundels. Lastly, the rooms themselves. The rooms were fronted by a thickened up double glazed unit, prefabricated unit fitting into the zinc and steel shell of the building itself. These were to act as impromptu fridges in winter and conservatories in summer, ensuring that over time the architecture of the building was disguised, hidden, reduced to its rightful place as a mere backdrop to the events and situations which took place within the building. Thank you.
got to give these slides to the projection people. Go around with them. Okay. First, just a little bit about the presentation which is going to come up. The slide machines, I think on the left there will be mostly drawings, and at the beginning pages from the report which we submitted for the Foyer competition, which I was hoping you'd be able to read, but I think the writing is going to be too small. But on the right side, you should see over the progression of the slides a growth of the model, which we did do after the competition, which tries to explain the spatial and structural themes of the project, because there seemed to be some trouble understanding at the time. And these, the main spatial theme of the project is to try and taking these people who, as people who, let's say, have some difficulty in fitting in with society and presumably in relating to themselves in the same ways, to try and develop a sense of individuality within them by providing them with a space of community where they could communicate with themselves, with each other, and with the city. So this way we tried to develop a kind of a space for this project which would allow the people to talk to each other and talk to the city or the society which surrounds it. So the building kind of opens itself up to the city and at the same time contains itself as a whole. I think hopefully we'll see how that develops with the imagery from the drawings. So it's very much a spatial concern which is going on within this project. Okay, these are the first slides we have on the left, the pages from the report, and on the right the kind of framing of the immediate context of the building. You see on the wire is the start of the railway bridge arch. You can see the start of the arch, and then I have to explain this actually properly. This here is the railway bridge, the railway track which runs along at a high level and then it arches over the canal down here. Here is the end of the existing Snow Hill house, which, as was pointed out earlier, contains a hostel for old men. And we have tried to wrap this facade into the facade of our building in creating a kind of U shape around the back in order to provide a kind of a court looking out that way towards the city. Here's a gable end. The street is actually higher than the canal level. This represents street height, and this is shown later in the sun. So this site is bounded by Water Street along here, the railway line which runs along this way, the canal which passes underneath the railway line in that direction, and here is the old Snow Hill house. So that is the facade I was talking about, and the immediate boundaries of the building are this gable end here, see on the right, this facade, the street, and the railway arch of the canal. And the sun, south is about there, and the sun just kind of streams into the site. It's quite extraordinary. And above the railway arch you get good visions of the city. Well, here you can't see anything. Okay, so this is a basic diagram showing the organization of the building in terms of an L volume of accommodation, which encloses this volume here and uses the existing Snow Hill House facade to make a three-sided kind of containment form, at the center of which is like a cubic volume, which is the central they call it communication in terms of movement space, where the people who live in the accommodation wings, which flow over the street, can go down into the social spaces which look onto the canal and onto the street directly at the street level to give life to the street. The whole thing we covered finally in order to almost emphasize its volumetry with a glass roof, which is in order to provide a kind of a house volume or a volume of a communal volume for these people, and they could sense that they belonged there and that they weren't just passing through in a short-term hostel or hotel-style thing. Here we see at the beginning that block of perspex in the middle represents this key volume which organizes the movement within the building. This is a sketch of the entrance level plan where we actually come up from the street and into a space which opens up as a large piazza, which is referred to as an espace trouvé, which is a kind of public space which we have tried to define in this project, which is which is open to the public and to the residents, and is full of sunshine, and therefore hopefully quite an active place. It is ringed, or rather edged, by shops down the front, either side of the entrance, and down here workshop spaces, which hopefully the occupants of the foyer will be able to come down, use, construct, and do that kind of thing in the process of their learning. Here, if you can make out, there is a study model which shows the volumetry of the project. It is an L-shaped wing of accommodation with the bedrooms in it, and two platforms of social spaces, of leisure spaces, rising up from the canal level towards the entrance level. So here we see the platforms start to develop. 1, 2, there is a cafe on the street side, above that is the canteen with the terrace. Somebody uses this building. And we have pulled these platforms away from the site boundaries in order to create a kind of a moat, which you'll see later on in the sections, which is particularly in this one here, to provide continuous circulation from the street towards the canal. Okay, these are sketches and visions. What this one represents here is taken from the other side of the railway arches. We see the canal which passes underneath this arch, like so, and then the road, Water Street, which passes underneath another arch, like so, and our building which rises up above that, and at the top there is what we termed a fitness box, or a sunroom, where people can enjoy visions of the city and get healthy or something, and enjoy the sun. This here illustrates how the building is pulled away from the existing site, as it were, the site boundaries, and reflecting almost something to do with water. We decided to curve it in, almost pulling the canal by a wall of glass into the Water Street area of this thing. And the idea was this chasm almost between the Snow Hill facade and the glass facade of the building would be activated by workshops, shops down this front here, and alongside the railway arch to guard a passage to give access to the canal further down. So here we start to have the drawings. There's a site plan, and this a wireframe AutoCAD drawing, which maybe develops some notion of the volumetry of the building. There's a glass roof, which contains this almost cubic volume, kind of cubic central space of the project, and is then almost held in its corner by the necessary structural column which supports this thing. Here is the glass wall of the workshops down there, and the cafe and bistro bar services which flood out in a way onto the canal side, which is lit with sun, and the terrace above that. And this surface here, which is up at this level, is the piazza, this kind of open space, which we hoped would work as an outdoor cinema. One of the things was to try an attempt to bring people in. The public was to use this space and the fourth side of this space, which is the space which is open city, to project onto a screen which would come down some films in order that people would come in, watch that, and the residents would then have a privileged position from their bedrooms and watch the films, including the residents, some of the residents of Snow Hill House there, in order to develop a communication amongst people. In these set of drawings, the plans, we're going to rise from canal level up to the gym level. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each time, if you can key in, the actual drawing level is denoted on the section beneath, and you can see how high we're going up the building. So here we're down at this level. There is a kind of the moat which separates the project from the existing buildings. These series of workshop spaces which are double height, and shops on the lower level which also have double height connections. And in the middle, here, in this kind of the heart of this part of the building, is the lecture theatre, or rather, it's more a theatre rather than a lecture theatre, maybe a performance room of some kind. And down at this low level, we have introduced a passage through the building, a kind of a labyrinthine passage which makes it available to the pedestrians here. They can actually go through the building. This is a section taken from Water Street through to the canal, and explains a little bit the kind of U-shaped containment of space here, which is there referred to on the facade. Here we see that we'll go on for a little bit here. Further details, the model will also grow upwards, more or less in correspondence with the plans, and maybe you'll be able to see some of the volumetrics going on anyway. One level further up, approaching the entrance level, we're starting rising from the street here. This is actually street level. Here are the double height spaces of workshops. This space here is the key volume, which sits in the corner of the L-shaped accommodation blocks, which rise even higher up here, and that is the key volume. Furthermore, we have cafes, terraces, and so forth. This is a facade from the canal, which is perhaps a bit diagrammatic, and there we're starting to see the model grow up with that key volume acting as an anchor for the space. The wire mesh is a brise soleil for the terrace at this level up here. And then, well, we'll carry on. This then is the main entrance level to the building. You come up steps, you go up about 2 meters onto the platform level, and find yourself in a space which is underneath the accommodation wing, L-shaped accommodation wing. If you follow the dotted line here, that is the profile of the accommodation wing which hangs over this space, and this space is trapped between the piazza, which forms this kind of curved space. So there's a glass wall which contains this space which one enters into and finds an exhibition space and reception. There's up here, and one is confronted immediately with the 3-story high volume of the main key space, circulation space. This is a principal section through here, section number 1. Shows the glass roof and various spaces. It's going to be difficult to talk about all these spaces, I think. What is happening in the model is illustrating the idea we're using of providing large communal spaces within the cellular accommodation of the bedroom wings in the kitchen spaces. These are double height spaces which people fade into. Well, here we go. That is, here we have the accommodation L-shaped wing. The corridors are large and on the upper stories quite varied in order that they too provide places of activity for the people who live within them. these are the kitchen spaces which kind of puncture through the building. Further up we'll see some more. And here is the way the building tries to develop the central part there. We have the basic cellular construction of the window. We are now at a level, we are 15 meters above, we are at this level here. There's a hole which we punch through the building. There are certain, the building in a way refers to it itself within its kind of, the development of its forms. In the same way as we were hoping that the people who used it would then communicate with each other. We're trying to develop a kind of wholeness out of parts. So that this curved wall here refers to the curved wall at the top, and then it's pulled through as almost in a high level through the building, so that one can see how it develops, hopefully. Here we see, this is looking from the city across the railway tracks towards the sunroom, the fitness box at the top. And what I should have explained earlier is that this access corridor here, in between two groups of cellular accommodation, further back, I'm not sure if I can go back. Yeah, there, maybe the one before. It breaks through. So this is the accommodation. We come around this corner and it becomes a glass screen, a sloping glass screen which rises up next to the railway track, providing this passage. And this then allows light which can come straight through the building. The sun sets over here. There's a glass screen, it goes through the kitchen spaces and into the main space, main volume. That's a notional cinema screen at the top. Which one are we on? Here we go, climbing higher up the building. This is the gym space up here. This thing here contains solariums, saunas, showers, and a basic weights room. This then is the glass roof which covers the central volume. Here's the second principal section through the building looking towards the canal. This is the 3-story volume which keys this space. And here are the sequence of social spaces which come down towards the canal. This is the hall, the theatre hall. Here is a public cafe. Here is a canteen with its brise soleil in the terrace. This is what they kind of TV lounge. And these are actually glass walls. So there's a transparency all the way through here at this level, which can be seen through the streets. So these are glass panes. And these are the actual double height kitchen spaces where people could sit as well as eat, where you could socialize. And just take on this wing and take this confirmation. Large sections through the building. The model, well, complete now. I imagine I don't. Have you been following it? This here is the bedroom layout, which we kept very simple, providing almost just a bare concrete shell, and then a design which we hope the users, prospective users, would get involved in the construction. It's just timber partition construction and tiling, and keeping the interior fittings really to a bare minimum, just sheets of wood which are packed on. These are AutoCAD drawings of the scheme, detail of the model. And I think that's it.
Must. Adam, you've got to remind me what to say. I can't see my notes. I don't even be able to remember the first line, let alone the whole thing. Can it only be that big? Okay. Yep. Could we have the first slide, please? Oh, that's Robert Mull's design. This is ours. Oh. Is there a problem? No? First slide. Thanks. You had it right in the first place. That's right. Yep. And do I operate it from here, do I? Yeah. Okay. Can we have the lights down? Okay. We have done this before last summer. Thanks to David Turnbull again. So my apologies to those friends who've heard it before. The words are the same, I'm afraid. That is if I can see my notes. Right, I'll be very brief, because I'm sure you will want me to be, and as concise and I think pretty well purely descriptive as I can be. The competition was organised in 2 stages. After the first stage, they chose a short list of 12 people to develop a more detailed design. And in the first stage of the competition, you had to submit some examples of your built work, which in our case wasn't very much, and a short page, really, of your ideas for the foyer in an abstract without seeing any site or brief. And we just wanted to show you the 7 images which we presented in association with some lengthy text, which I won't bore you with. And these are the 7, which were associated with 7 words, the words representing ideas or issues that we thought it was very important to address when designing the building. The first one was society. The second one was institution. The third was framework. Contextualism. Openness. Building. And belonging. Is it possible to have the lights down? I didn't want them put up. Thanks, great. Okay. Okay, the first image is a photograph looking from the roof of the Snow Hill Centre, the men's hostel, which was adjacent to the site. The site is off the picture to the right-hand side, and you can see off to the right the Snow Hill Station, whose disused tracks came right across adjacent to the site itself. And these are some of the competitors. This is the time when we all went to visit the site and were briefed. We were interested in making a community of the building having a symbiotic relationship with its neighbourhood. And initially we used the analogy of the traditional role of the monastery in relation to the town, where in a monastery there is obviously a very private place for the individual, but there's a symbiotic relationship between the monks and the community of the town. And to this end we were looking for a transparency between the communal spaces of the building and the surrounding city. And we were looking for a language of architecture which would reflect a symbiosis of form with the fabric of the city. And that was very much in opposition, we thought, to the idea of making a landmark building. We didn't want to make a building that was standing out from its site. We wanted it to have a sense of belonging to its site. We really love the site. Birmingham has an extraordinary three-dimensionality to it. It's a kind of really tough place where, if you look at it through our eyes at least, there's a kind of ease of the relationship of old and new buildings, a really powerful mixture of scales, big and small, and kind of areas of city planning shoulder to shoulder, some of which is open and some of which is closed. We really liked that. The site itself was initially very disorientating. This is an image of the model taken from the other side of the railway viaduct from the site. The main quality of the site was that it related to three levels of the city. The level of the canal, which is the big arch on the right-hand side, the level of the road, which is the smaller arch on the left-hand side, and the level of the viaduct, which was a huge tract of disused land, potentially to be reused as a tramway. And there was no real importance given to the ground level over the other two levels. This is an image of the model looking from the street side, potentially at the street front of the building. So we tried to place the building so that it became a spatial pivot at the junction of three lines of movement: the road, the canal, the railway, not giving any preference to any particular level, but distributing activities of the building through those three levels so that it became a much more strongly three-dimensional collection of spaces. So in this model you can see along the street level there's a seam of space where the main entrance to the building occurred, where most of the communal activities, the dining, the shopping, and where you met members of the public. Above that level then there was 2 stories, solid stories of residential accommodation. We tried to keep the a centre of gravity of the building as low as we possibly could, so that you could easily walk up to your room, and for the sake of economy. And then at the level of the railway track, which is off to the right, the building had a flat surface, and above that the massing of the rooms broke up into two towers. We were interested in the building having a relationship to the geological character of the Victorian infrastructure. It's the drawing showing its relationship to the canal level. The site stepped down beside the building to the canal, and on that corner of the canal and the steps was a large public restaurant. And at the level of the viaduct, where potentially there would be new train tracks, there was to be an outdoor five-a-side football pitch fenced in between the two towers of the building, where you could look out across the tracks at the skyline of the city. And we proposed that other sites along that viaduct level would also be used as sports facilities. The level of the viaduct was like a tabletop, a plane of the city, an important level which slid over the site of the building to make this new datum, and then the two residential towers rose up above that level at two different scales, 2 and 3 stories, contributing in a modest way to the varied skyline and profile of the city. Right, in terms of the organisation of the building, we were looking for a continuity of space between the inside and the spaces of the city, which we were trying to make explicit by a lack of boundaries between the foyer and its community. And we used the analogy of Schindler's own house, the open style of living between the two families that occupied the house, where really the hierarchy of space was made not by walls but by the robust presence of quite strong materials. This is the ground floor of the foyer, with the street along the bottom, the viaduct off to the right, and the canal level at the top. Other than the goods entrance, which is on the left-hand side, and the retail units, which were on the street at the bottom, the ground floor of the foyer was really one single open space, with intentionally quite a subtle definition between the different spaces of the floor. So the definition was really made by changes in floor level, changes in the material of the floor, the presence of quite big pieces of furniture like serveries and big cupboards and sliding screens. And this is the same plan showing the adjacency of the different activities of the floor. And at the focus of the floor, in the centre of this plan, is the canteen, which is a roof-lit space, and then the more public activities were arranged around the perimeter. From this floor you could walk to the outer edges of the plan to 3 staircases, one at the top, one on the right, and one just here which led to a staircase on the outside of the building, from where you could walk up to your bedroom. As I said, we kept the centre of gravity of the building low, so that 75% of the rooms were within 2 stories of the ground floor, so that you didn't have to use a lift. We wanted the staircases to become important spaces in the building, and they were put on the outside so that they had windows and you could look out from them. And they were intentionally quite big, the stairs. This is a plan at the first floor, and the second floor is similar. When you come onto the floor from a staircase, grouped adjacent to that staircase are the communal facilities of the floor. So there was a kitchen, shared bathroom, and a TV room, which were arranged in 3 groupings. You can see them in this plan here. On the interior of the building essentially is making a courtyard wrapped around the back of the men's hostel. So there's an internal space, a more private space, and then the exterior of the building is made by a line of rooms, the maximum number of rooms having frontage to the outside, making this quite hard, quite solid perimeter. The construction of the building was extremely simple. It was a slip-form concrete construction where only the cross walls of the bedrooms were made in concrete and everything else was assembled in an infill manner, dry construction after. So the idea of those 3 communal spaces was that they looked across at each other, across the courtyard, and they looked down through the roof lights into the canteen, which was the focus of the foyer. This is a perspective and plan of the bedroom, where, again, we were trying to make the space of the room, albeit extremely small, about 10 square meters, as interesting as possible through the device of making the bathroom, the bedroom, the desk and the cupboard into pieces of furniture at different scales, which stood within this very robust space, which was basically the space between 2 varnished concrete walls. There's a section through the courtyard space between the road on the right and the canal on the left. Those TV rooms that I described earlier are distributed differently on each of the floors on the inside, so that there's a very relaxed arrangement of bedrooms facing into the interior space of the foyer. The bathrooms and the cupboards are painted in a set of 3 colours, which hopefully would make the inside of that courtyard space feel very soft, and it's predominantly white and clear glazing, which makes it relatively reflective and light. In terms of its material presence, we wanted the building to have a very strong textural density in order that it could actually stand there adjacent to the quite dark and strong Victorian neighbours. And in the northern tradition, where the light is very soft, we were looking for quite a fine vertical articulation of the surface of the building. This is a building in the city by Berlacher. And we proposed to clad the building with a rain screen of corrugated fibre cement. We were planning to use the material in a relatively sophisticated way, putting some colour mixture into the cement mix and then glazing the panel in an autoclave to give it the quality of faience. And the idea was then that the elevations would have this very quite powerful grain to them, which would give each of the 3 elevations, all of which are differently proportioned L shapes, quite a significant strength to absorb all the different variety of window patterns that were accommodated within the main block of the building. The window patterns of individual bedrooms, of shared bedrooms, and of staircases. We used the material in its unit length, so that it could be applied very economically to the facade, and the floor levels were then marked by quite pronounced string courses of concrete, precast. We wanted to prove that the building could be constructed very cheaply, because we were keen to win, and we did 1 to 5 trial construction drawings of the two types of facade. The building had almost no details other than the exteriors. Left-hand side is the corrugated cement rain screen on the outside of the building, relatively rough and textured, and the right-hand side is the extruded aluminium curtain wall and glazing of the bedrooms on the inside. And finally, we asked a student of mine from University of North London, a very talented student, Luminita Musat, who draws very differently from us, to do a couple of quite big images which were to do with testing the material presence of the building on the site. This is a view looking along the centre of the canal, building on the right, and a view looking at the building across the tracks of the elevated railway. Thank you.
Right, thank you. It's pertinent to me that Peter concluded with a comment on the structural economy of their proposal, because as we've heard in the architectural press in Britain this week, the winning entry has been costed at £3 million, and so has gone significantly over budget, and so is threatened with not being built at all, and Shape having difficulty raising any additional money to even progress the project further. So it's quite clear that both structure and constructional economy on the one hand, but also kind of attitudes to institutional form underpin the design of this new building type. You probably appreciate, having seen 3 presentations this evening, quite how difficult it was to write something about these projects, because of their very, very emphatic differences, both in attitude to the institution itself, but also an attitude to form making and construction. I'm still completely perplexed about Atelier Seraji's scheme. I haven't worked out its spatial organisation at all, even though it seemed to be the most enticing architectural object. I thought one of the most intriguing things that Laith said was that it refers entirely to itself. And I wondered whether anybody had any comments about that, because it seemed to me that it's very clear in the Beevor and Mull scheme, and also the Caruso and St John scheme, that there is a very carefully thought through and intricate negotiation between the architectural manoeuvres of the building and its relationship to the city at large, which are kind of describable and thought through. I think it's much more difficult to talk in those terms about the Seraji scheme. When I was trying to think about something to say about it, it seemed to me that one area of consideration was, in the light of the discussion being almost purely about the form, that there was potential to think of it in terms of a negotiation of surrealism and modernism in Paris in the early part of this century, which continues to inform much of contemporary architectural production in that city. That Nasrine's American Centre played with found spaces and found objects in the same way that this project perhaps plays with a kind of surrealist negotiation with interior-exterior relationships like the Parisian arcades, so on and so forth. And in Caruso and St John's scheme, I think it's very interesting and again kind of paradoxical interrelation between a kind of an apparent interest in being anti-utopian and non-idealistic, and a kind of explicit idealism. And I think that's most clear in the anticipated lifestyle of the occupants, with these strange varnished concrete walls and highly specified timber boxes around which their life is conducted. And in Beevor and Mull's proposal, a completely different take on the lifestyle of the occupants, which I characterised as continuous to read, maybe wrongly, I don't know, but as a kind of certainly different expectations, both in terms of tribal character, which seemed to me to be peculiar to divide the population of a building of this sort up into 3 distinct houses with housemasters and kind of internal hierarchies within those houses, which seemed to me to be more to do with the English public school system, or a kind of a different take on life from that one might anticipate in an institution of this type. That there was a kind of repressed or barely repressed conservatism in all the schemes, that there was a kind of a looking back at rather more optimistic moments in art and architectural history, and a complete failure of nerve when it came to really tackling the novel institutional form that the Foyer, as a type, seemed to suggest might be possible. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts. If anyone would like to address a question at one of the participants.
I think it's conservative to call the Foyer
Very deeply, I said. I didn't actually. Maybe it's kind of. I know I used it now, but I think type is probably the wrong word. I called it a novel institutional form, which is probably equally conservative. I don't. In Adam and Peter's scheme, there was a very, very explicit leaning on traditional institutional forms on the one hand, which was kind of tentatively undermined by this style-like arrangement, a more open space plan in the lower areas, which seemed to me to have a very direct relation to the work of Candelis, Josick and Woods in the post-Siam period, kind of open space architecture vying with cellular, closed, highly subdivided traditional institutional forms on the other. But with that negotiation was never pursued as far as it had been by Candelis, Josick and Woods and others in their Frankfurt scheme and the Free University in Berlin. It was left as a kind of dualism, which was left kind of reconciled. And I felt that in Beevor and Mull's scheme, there was a kind of very peculiar the characterization of the open or flexible or subdivisible or movable spaces in the lower areas of the building as a landscape seemed to me to be most intriguing because, in a way, Robert and Katrina, through teaching here and in the post-NATO experience, aligning themselves with the situation strategies, have actually taken on board the more kind of I can't get the word right, but kind of the estrangement that goes with characterizing as an internal space as something as abstract and as open as a landscape. I mean, that isn't actually a landscape, it's actually something else, but the term used was compelling because of its relationship with some situationist ideas like Gilles Ivin's formula for new urbanism, the city he describes, where the inhabitants are involved in a continuous derived, in game playing with the city, carving out new identities, new strategies which are constantly changing. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of paradox, which was that those situationist strategies were actually involved with attacking the modern city as it was evolving at the time. And yet now we're in a situation which is quite different from that. And those strategies actually play back on themselves and become kind of conservatism. Does that make any sense? Probably not. But I don't know. Robert, have you got any thoughts about it?
No, I was Don to answer to this one.
Well, I mean, the sort of classification, I mean, this question one of time, but also this classification, which you, in Robert's scheme, you have this broad categorical term of landscape, and then you have a typological term of lodge.
Yeah.
And I wonder which one is the more situational.
Right.
As a counter.
As a counter.
Well, as a counter, because I mean, if you take your analysis that, in fact, after the inclusion or assimilation of situationist procedures as something, therefore, when they themselves were counter, they become, in fact, propositional condition. It seems to me that calling something that is about disenfranchised individual, calling it a lodge, which is about, you know, at least in the English terminology, it's always been associated to estates, guardhouses,
Yeah.
estates, guardhouses that go with estates, parks, and so on and so forth. That, actually, that takes on the possibility, or at least the potential for being more disruptive terminology
Than the landscape.
than landscape.
Yeah.
They're an essential pair. I think you might assume the landscape, exactly what you're saying. You might assume the landscape is the more large space, in the sense that you're right. The overstatement of the lodge is some sort of bourgeois fantasy. It's essential in terms of undermining and activating the landscape.
But it also, I mean, it brings this sort of invisible residue, which is the somewhere, is the state dynamic.
It's very comfortable.
Irene.
I think it'd be interesting to ask for a bit longer whether the schemes are conservative. I mean, the way I understood with the response of all the architects who have told tonight was to try to respond with a degree of precision, and at least various degrees, with realism to what the brief was asking. And I am wondering to what extent, in the current architectural context, this degree of realism is precisely not what could be described as radical. And I mean, I know that this issue of being radical rather than conservative is at heart, for example, with Adam. And I wonder whether you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that this conversation doesn't kind of stay on the level of linguistics because, you know, I don't find it very interesting, really. I hope the other people who presented their schemes don't either. And I think our scheme wasn't about linguistics. Yeah? It was trying to be about concrete things. And I guess our position, I mean, Irene knows it well, but our position is to build is to be radical. And I guess when David says what he just said, and we've had this discussion before, I always ask myself, and Peter and I are kind of, you know, we're in the office kind of wondering, what does he mean? What isn't conservative? What wouldn't be conservative to David? And we have some idea what might not be conservative to David, but we're not sure. I mean, we were trying to do something which was rooted in the place, which had a realism about it in terms of that it was buildable in a poetic way, not in a kind of haphazard way. I mean, because that's something we think is important. We're interested in building in a poetic way. And that was, we thought, wildly idealistic because we were proposing in 1992 an institution that might be humane, that might be humanist, that might actually engage with the city, might actually provide a series of spaces that would, in some tiny way, enrich the possibilities of the people who lived within it. And to us, that's being idealistic, and idealism is radical, because idealism suggests that you're not prepared to accept the status quo. I guess that's what our position is.
I have some difficulty sensing from the presentation just what the attitude was towards this, you mentioned, this institution. Possibly Robert's was a bit more positive in this respect, but I mean, I listened to the introduction as to what the foyer was intended to be, and I visited the exhibition at local university, and I must say I was confused about what the intention of the competition was, what the responses, whether they wanted it to be some kind of rock bottom place or some quite comfortable place, whether it was permanent, whether it was kind of hotel. And what I said that was required was some identification of an attitude as to its typology. I don't mean the building, but as an institution.
I think that's what the competition should have been. And that's what it needed to have been in order to usurp what's happened to the Foyer programme since the competition. In fact, happening during the competition. It was wedded to a very particular programme which had been developed by the Birmingham Housing Association. And as competitors, you were torn between the almost impossible conundrum as to whether you answered the brief in order to reach the point where you might be able to realise a project which would then carry with it an echo of that intention, or whether you jettisoned that completely and you dealt with it in a completely different way. And I think that was the central problem of the competition, and probably it's the central problem for the schemes that you see. A sort of lack of lack of clarity as to whether one's going to the whole lot and trying to unseat the complacency of the housing association and funding bodies and the architecture foundation to a certain degree, or whether you're actually trying to wheedle your way and get a foot in the door and then sort of do the nasty at that point. Unfortunately, that happened. It's just, we have a heroic thing that's not going to be built. Meanwhile, everywhere else in the country, housing associations are merrily churning away exactly the same thing.
I mean, has the competition been an effective contribution to the problem solved in the end?
I was careful to point out, I think, at the beginning of this evening, that this institution is not really targeted at the issue of homelessness. It is right. Well, I think that Robert actually pointed out why this wasn't and isn't, and that is because the way in which the Architecture Foundation ran the competition was that they did it in 3 stages. The first stage of which was to go out and find a client, and that the client established the program for the building, and that client. I mean,
it doesn't need an answer. I mean, I just think it's important.
No, but to be, I mean, one thing that I don't know if you said clearly enough was that in France, foyers have existed for 40 years, and there's a network of 200 or 300 foyers across the country, and they function as an incredibly, I mean, to me it seems an idealistic thing, and also quite a successful way of giving young people mobility. People who don't choose or aren't able, although in France it's less of a case of not being able, to go on to higher to university. And so it's a place you can go, you can get out of your home, whether you might have to or you might want to, and it's a way that if you're down in Marseille or Lyon, you can go up to Paris, and because it's a network that covers the country, it gives you this mobility, it gives you this power. It powers, which is something that your text in the files is all about, and that's good enough. I mean, yes, there's other problems, but I mean, this was about one problem, and it seemed to us that to do that in Britain today was, you had to take that on. I mean, it could be better, yes. But to be honest, I mean, the brief was impossible because the brief was actually developed for a bigger site, so you had to make some decisions. But the essence of the brief, there was nothing objectionable about it. It was neutral, it was there. It was a mix between cellular and public space, quite a bit of cellular space, which made it difficult to make a building, to make an institution out of it. You know, it didn't have a church and a refectory, and you know, it didn't have quite as many things as some traditional institutions might have to give it a balance. But it wasn't actually a problem. And many of the schemes, I think, enacted a balance. So it didn't. So it seemed like a new kind of institution.
Was that absence of definition contributory to why you called the ground floor area landscape? I mean, it's not as if the ground floor has been stipulated.
The landscape, the name that is simply a naming process, convenient moniker that actually allows people to identify it in a very simple way. The amount of manganese of wondering what it meant was not intended. It simply acts as an easy handle which to conceive of 2 parts of it.
But I think that it's important that it was called landscape. These people called it a landscape too. The Talier Seraji referred to landscape as an abstract notion in their proposal also. There is something to do with
It's in the air, though, isn't it?
It's in the air, and there's a kind of as an abstraction, it encompasses a kind of estrangement and dislocation from the setting that surrounds it, that kind of is within the word, and I think it's absolutely pertinent that all 3 practices locate their schemes in and around that term.
I would associate landscape as picnics and sunbathing and play, not.
Yes, but
we're going to get into that.
Okay, and it's not about alienation either. I mean, when we use landscape, and it's under the influence of people like Florian.
It's a natural term, isn't it? A term to describe nature rather than
But
culture.
people are using it to describe the city, and it's a way of reconciling seemingly irreconcilable things in the city. If you read the city topologically and topographically, it becomes a landscape, and it means that you can deal with building in the contemporary city better.
What interests me is that the apparent ambivalence to what this institution is, or how many kind of facilities it might contain, whether it's a minimalist kind of operation or whether it's going to be try to be attain a certain degree of facility. I'm not ambiguity seems covered by referring to the ground floor area, or the notion that of the part that is not the centre of the logic or flat or apartment, as by using a quasi-natural term like landscape, because it's not clear. In the sense that the most sensitive part of the Foyer project is the foyer of the foyer.
Well, it seems to me there is a lot of hope in this version of landscape, also because strategies before which were based on catching up the city, with whatever it is, typologies, a lot, just didn't work. And people are putting a lot of hope in that notion. It'd be interesting to find out whether it works. But I think just one point about the program. I think one shouldn't be too optimistic about the success of the French policy. I think there are suppliers in France who work under amazing pressures, and one can be sure that they don't always work for the people they are intended, which in my mind would have been an aspect also of the program, or at least which is or could be an aspect of the response to on the part of the architect program. And to make yet another separate point, but you mentioned that the Nasrine Seraji scheme, as far as you saw it, was quite autonomous. I don't think so. I think maybe you think that because the forms do not actually refer to something which is stated, or perhaps even which is conscious. But what the forms relate to, and that seems to be eminently architectural, is to the program.
Well, I think within the scheme, when I did say that the project refers to itself, I didn't mean only to itself. I mean, there are moves within the project which could be read in different parts of the building, which would recall other moves which would be made in other parts of the building, in order to develop a sense of continuity as you move around it, so that you kind of get reflections of the building within itself. But the actual shaping of the project did a lot. It was mostly derived from the context and the forces of the site and those of the program. It wasn't actually a kind of an imposition of a totally ideal volume on the site and say there you are, with a sense of a generation of communal space. But there was a lot of contextual moves within the project which maybe were not explained.
I think distinguishes, Robert Katrina's scheme from the others is I felt that the other two schemes had a fantasy of a community within them. That was also in a way prescriptive and determined in relation to various models that were used for it. And I didn't think that Roberts did, because I think this is an important issue, but I wonder whether not being prescriptive means that you have to be as self-effacing or deny a responsibility for the architecture in the way that I felt that you did.
Wishful thinking, I think. One, it's strategic to deny responsibility for the architecture, but the architecture has to be the architecture which we try to deny responsibility for. Is strident, intentionally strident, in an intentionally crude, banal way, in order to actually play with exactly that sort of dilemma.
But for me, what I said was pejorative, I didn't mean it to be that pejorative, but the degree to which it means that you refrain from giving a form to something, or giving a definition to something, rather than making something simply flexible, or being able to be adapted, or because in a strange way I found it evocative of the confidence of what happens when all those other things don't happen, and the degree to which it then became reliant upon those things.
But I think the project is extremely incomplete, and it would require this act of cooperation of part of any housing associations to do it. The architecture of it is completely stranded in without the managerial and financial cooperation of a housing association. In this particular situation, this particular project, Foyer, that is the key move, and that was the key move that was lacking in the Shapes brief. There was a tinge, a smell of paternalism, of pushing the issues under the carpet and so on. Also an incredibly smug attitude towards the whole process of exposing that cosy world of the housing association's policies to an architectural debate. They were resistant to that from day one. It served their purposes enormously well to £3.5 million each one. Because the short exits they knew exactly what they were going to do before the competition started. And it served in a sense to, from the perspective of looking at it from a distance and looking at it when you're talking to housing associations in sort of Corby and strange places about foyers, it strengthened their arm in the worst possible way. It's proven to them once and for all that architects are indulgent, expensive, and so on. Which again is a great shame. It's a strange inversion of the ambitions of the competition. I think there's a lot of work to be done in sort of retrieving that situation. Because in essence, the Foyer program is interesting. Although it's not a sort of flamboyant answer to the homeless project, it will give some sort of accommodation to a certain number of people that don't use the Foyer.
The question to the other two about the fantasy of community that existed in both buildings and also in the description.
What do you mean by the fantasy of community? I'm not quite sure I understand. You're saying that it's possible to design architecture which will be successful in creating community within it, that the space and community are necessarily grow without being designed? I don't understand this question.
Well, the word was used in a positive and recuperative way, where I find it very difficult to use the word or make those assumptions about use of space, about the way that the effect it will have, given that it also, the building by its program also has this constant transitory quality.
Well, I think I'm not sure that the program is that transitory. The people who are going to live or would be going to live in this Foyer building are there for quite a long time. They're not in and out within 3 months. Most of them would stay, live, work, and learn. I think that is one of the important things why one would try and develop a sense of community with the architecture. It's not like a hotel where you live out.
It was between 6 months and 2 years. That would be the stay in the Foyer. Yeah? That's just for your information.
Sheila Ketney of Shelton said something very interesting on day one. She said the main problem is going to be getting people out of it at the end of 2 years. It's central to the programme that they get chucked out onto the streets at the end of 2 years. If it's too comfortable, we won't be able to get them out. That's your principal problem. So maybe a sense of community is temporary.
What do you think about this idea? I mean, we have all these collection houses, we have psychiatric clinics, we have chairs, we have kindergarten, we have schools, we have all kind of institutions, students' houses, where you can classify people living in. I'm now thinking about people who are using Foyer, perhaps lived on the street, and now you try to integrate them. Do you think it's a good idea to have them all in one place, and that they have to start in an artificial environment where they are somehow excluded from life? I mean, one of the problems is this building, or Foyer building, you can't meet in your hall, in your yard, normal families. So there is something very strange about this program. To start to build up a program for a new breed of human beings, Foyer people. So what do you think about this? So perhaps I understood it wrong.
Just correcting one thing, we used to have different types of hostel, we used to have different types of care in the community and so on. It's quite uncanny that while the government and the Housing Corporation were making such a song and dance about the Foyer, they were slowly axing all of the rest of the hostels that were part of the housing association programme. We're left only with Foyers, and we're hardly know the rest.
And the Foyer programme, if it is to succeed, is actually dependent on because it isn't addressed at young homeless people who are coming off the streets as you described them. It's a second or third step. Having been through one kind of institution, people have to pass a test in order to be able to get accepted into a foyer.
But they could be, come on, they could be 16-year-olds moving from their house.
Well, they could be.
I mean, there was a big thing in the brief, and I mean, I'm not using the brief as a justification, but that no special needs people would be in the foyer. That's not what the foyer is for. So, I mean, our reading of it was that it was very much like a university residence, but you weren't going to university, there were other kinds of learning you were doing. And I mean, is a university residence such a heinous institution? I don't know. If you live in an apartment building, you don't meet families in the garden either. I mean, what are you asking for? That everyone lives in a house? I mean... Yeah.
Sorry.
One of the things that's common with the three schemes is that at one level, at the lower levels, they're talking about community and sort of integrated, cooking together, all this kind of thing. Then you get up to their rooms. They're in singular rooms with their own toilet, washing facilities. This is very, I mean, that approach, I don't understand why the community wasn't carried through more in terms of where they were sleeping and actually living.
But, I mean, it's very dangerous territory to start trying to impose models of community on the way that people live. I don't think we were trying to do that. I mean, these are young people coming, in many cases, leaving home for the first time, coming to a big city, and they don't necessarily know who or what they're doing with themselves. And why is this idea of community and mutual support so difficult to actually talk about? What we were trying to do in our building was to provide a whole range of scales of space in the building between being able to sit in your room and be totally private, to being downstairs or out on the street where you were in relationship to huge numbers of people. And I think what we were trying to do is put some different scales of space between those two situations so that people had a wide variety of places in which they could find their situation that they were happy with. Why is it so difficult to why is that? Why do you see that as such a
description of space? That's a description of the way space might be structured. Is incredibly foreign to me. I find it fantasy. That's the way there are these gradations, and they have spatial correlations, and it's foreign to me.
But okay, to be facile, then they have different sizes. Do you have a problem with that? To provide a variety of sizes of space, and they happen to have. There happens to be kind of a different connectivity between the different sizes of space.
I don't think that's the issue. That you just unpick one little bit of the description and we talk about that.
Doesn't giving an individual his own private space, giving him the ability to cut himself off the community.
Also gives you the strength to maybe go out. I mean, I don't know where you people have been living, but I mean, I guess we just based it on personal experience because that's all we could live. I mean, we both lived in residences, and both of us survived it. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about this, but I quite enjoyed living in a university residence my first year of university. And it wasn't a brilliant building, it was okay, and I happened to be next to the kitchen where they kept the beer, so it was really loud. You know, at 2 in the morning there'd be a party or something going on, but it was just a building, and it had roughly this description of space, which every single scheme had those descriptions of spaces. I mean, it seems to me you couldn't escape them, and I don't know what you're talking about. I wish, tell me what the other version is.
I think we could extend the question and say, what is it which is problematic about the idea of a program as it is stated by a client? Many clients use those words, all right, there is
there was fantasy relating to the brief, that in some senses, and it was a mismatch between the ambitions of the Housing Association and the ambitions of the Architecture Foundation. It was a fantasy that in some way it really was a prototype. The reality was different. The reality was it was a brief. And the minor adjustments one was capable of making within that brief somehow made the more autonomous houses, which make them more sort of cosy as little common spaces within them. Our minor adjustments to the orthodoxy which was written into the brief. And I think it is a shame that none of us actually really broke away from that completely. As Peter said, we wanted to win. We wanted to build the damn thing, and the judgment was in building the thing, you empowered yourself to be more effective.
I'm conscious that the conversation's been kind of driven in this direction. Is there anybody on this side of the room who'd like to make a contribution?
Well, there's a point I'd like to pick up that Robert made. He was talking about in a way perhaps his questions going over all ground, but the issue of the constructability of it and how you'd be aiming for a low capital cost but high maintenance. And as a proposal, I find that interesting. I wish, and you're very conscientious in the way you explained other sources of revenue that the building would generate, but I sort of felt disappointed that you didn't explain the pragmatic of how that would be realized as a notion.
It's hard to sort of do it very simply, but it really is basically adopting some of the methods of construction which are common to design and build, speed of construction and so on, which inevitably substitutes the normal housing association's concern with no maintenance whatsoever, which is their total obsession for a building which would have to be reclad within 10 years and so on and so forth. And it seemed that it was a way of ensuring that low-cost buildings, which had some degree of integrity, varying degrees of integrity, were capable of winning in the bidding process. It's extremely difficult to compete with the Housing Association project, which has gone through the mill of being refined for years and years and years. The roof trusses are supplied by Gangnair and so on and so forth. That is an incredibly refined system. And we saw in the whole possibility of design and build actually a way of producing an architecture which could compete with that. That's very cheap. One bedroom flat is £25,000. And I think it's essential that something out of some echo of these foyers actually are capable of winning bids at some point in the future. Otherwise the whole thing's been wasted.
Well, that certainly is a fear because we know the way history has gone. I think sitting in the room today is all rather frustrated that if only it's the experience of schemes that remain on paper that we can draw
from. And these sadly will remain on paper, but hopefully something will happen in the near future, which, and as I said, the Simpson scheme seems unlikely that it will actually go ahead, and that, as Robert's pointed out, is really a pretty substantial nail in the coffin of the Foyer programme. I think that in relation to Peter's point about the fantasy of communality, and also in relation to an imagined lack of conviction or precision in the way in which Katrina and Robert prescribe that kind of communality in the way in which they put their lodges and landscape together, I think it's probably not quite right, because I think that there are different